The locks were changed on a Tuesday morning while she was still inside. She heard the locksmith before she saw him. The specific metallic clatter of a drill bag being unzipped on the front steps at 8:47 a.m., followed by the creak of the security door being propped open. She was in the kitchen making ogi the way she had made it every Tuesday morning for 39 years. The slow stir, the ladle angled just so. The heat kept low enough that it would not catch at the bottom. She turned off the gas. She walked to the hallway. The locksmith was a young man in a red polo shirt who did not look at her when she appeared in the doorway. He was focused on the deadbolt. He had already changed the bottom lock. She sighed. "What are you doing?" A sighed, without looking up. "Replacement. Standard job." He said it the way people say things when someone else is paying them, and they have decided the situation is not theirs to interpret. Her name was Constance Nadukwe. She was 64 years old, 5 feet and 3 inches tall, 142 pounds, on the last scale she had stood on, which was the one at the clinic on Abba Road in Port Harcourt, where her doctor had given her a blood pressure reading she had folded into her purse and not yet showed anyone. She was wearing a house dress she had owned for 11 years, a dark green cotton with small yellow flowers, washed so many times the yellow had softened to cream. The dress was clean. She had ironed it that morning at 6. She ironed everything she owned, including her house dresses, including the ones she wore only to cook and to sit, because that was something her mother had taught her, and she had never found a reason not to continue it. She had lived in this house on Rumuola Road in Port Harcourt for 14 years. She had moved into it with her son Dubem in 2010, when he was 32 and newly promoted to regional manager at the construction firm that had since made him wealthy enough to buy the house 3 times over and call it petty cash. She had moved in to help because he had asked her to, because he had said he needed someone in the house he could trust. She had trusted that this was an arrangement that would hold. The girl's name was Sandra. Constance had known of her existence for 4 months, since the Sunday Dubem had brought her to dinner at the house without calling ahead and seated her at the head of the table with the practiced authority of someone who has been rehearsing this. Introducción for longer than the audience suspects. Sandra was 27 years old. She had white nails and a laugh that arrived before the joke. She had looked at the house the way you look at a hotel room when you are deciding whether the grade matches your expectations. Constance had cooked joff rice and fried chicken and ofada stew that Sunday. 3 dishes because that was what she did when there was a guest. She cooked as if abundance were a form of welcome, because her own mother had taught her that too. Sandra had eaten 4 tablespoons of the rice and left the rest. She had said, "I don't really do heavy food." She had not looked at Constance when she said it. That had been 4 months ago. The next 3 months had not been loud. The difficulty had arrived quietly, through small adjustments that accumulated in the way that all significant changes accumulate, not in one blow, but in a series of small rearrangements so gradual you could almost convince yourself nothing was moving. Sandra had begun spending 3 or 4 nights at the house each week by October. By November, she had her own drawer in the bathroom cabinet. By the second week of November, she had asked Dubem, within Constance's hearing, whether the spare room might be made into a dressing room. She had not framed it as a question about Constance. She had framed it as a question about storage. Dubem had not answered immediately. He had looked at the table. He had said, "We'll sort it out." That was the night Constance understood what was coming. Not what was coming on that particular Tuesday morning. Not the locksmith specifically. Not the suitcase she had not packed. But the general direction of things. She had understood it the way you understand a change in weather before it arrives. Not from a single sign, but from the particular quality of the air. She had not said anything to Dubem after that dinner. She had washed up, put the dishes away, wiped down the kitchen counter, and gone to her room. The small garden at the side of the house had her ixora in it, and the mango seedling she had planted from a stone in her 3rd year at the house, which was now 4 feet tall. She had looked at the mango seedling from her window before she went to bed. She had thought about whether you could move a 4-foot mango tree without killing it, and decided you probably could not. Now there was a locksmith on the front steps and a suitcase in the hallway that Constance had not packed, which meant someone else had packed it, which meant someone had been in her room. She stood in the hallway and looked at the suitcase for a long time. It was her suitcase, the old brown one with the broken wheel she had been meaning to replace since 2018, the one she used for her annual trip to Enugu to visit her sister Pauline. It was standing upright beside the door. Someone had attached a folded note to the handle with a rubber band. She did not read the note. Not yet. She looked at the suitcase, and then she looked at the locksmith. And then she went back to the kitchen and stood over the pot of ogi for a while, the ladle in her hand, the heat off. The ogi already past the point where you could save it. Dubem's number rang 8 times and went to voicemail. She did not leave a message. She tried again at 9:15, again at 9:31. On the fourth call, at 9:47, he answered. He sighed her name once, Mama, and the way he said it told her everything the note on the suitcase would say. It was not the voice of a man who did not know what was happening. It was the voice of a man who had been hoping that what was happening would be over before he had to speak to it directly. He sighed, I should have told you earlier. Sandra is moving in and she needs... He stopped. He started again. She's not comfortable with the arrangement. Constance sighed nothing. He said, I've arranged for somewhere. Auntie Chidinma's house in Rumokuta. You know her. She has the room at the back. You'd be comfortable there. I'll send money every. She sighed, You changed my locks, Dubem. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, They're not your locks, Mama. The house is in my name. She had no answer for that. Because it was true. The house was in his name. She had never asked for it to be in her name. She had moved in at his request and cooked his food and ironed his shirts and kept the compound tidy and planted the small garden at the side of the house where the ixiora and the small mango seedling now grew. And she had done all of it without a document that said she was owed anything for any of it. That was the nature of the arrangement. That was also the nature of the gap that had just opened beneath her feet. She sighed, I'll be gone by noon. He said, Mama. She had already taken the phone from her ear. She did not hang up. She set it on the kitchen counter, face down, and she went back to the hallway. And she read the note. It said that there was an envelope with 30,000 naira on the dining table. Constance went to the dining table. She took the envelope. She counted the notes inside. There were 20, each 1,500 naira, which totaled exactly 30,000. She folded the envelope and put it in the pocket of the house dress, and then she went to her room and looked at the open wardrobe and understood that whoever had packed the suitcase had not opened the wardrobe, which meant her clothes were still there, which meant the suitcase contained only what had been on the dresser and on the bedside table. She packed the rest herself. She was precise, and she was quiet, and she folded everything before it went in, including the dark green house dress, which she changed out of and replaced with a dark blue wrapper and blouse she had bought at Ariaria Market in Aba in 2016 for 6,500 naira. The blouse had embroidered trim at the collar. She wore it on occasions that required her to look like what she was. She was done by 11:20. She dragged the suitcase, bad wheel and all, to the front step. The locksmith had finished his work and gone. The new keys were nowhere she could see, which confirmed that they had never been intended for her. She sat on the suitcase the way her mother used to sit on luggage at bus stations, straight back, both feet flat on the ground, hands in her lap. The harmattan was just beginning to move through Port Harcourt that week, a dry, thin quality to the air, dust on every surface, the kind of morning that made your lips feel tight by 10 a.m. A neighbor, Mrs. Esse, from the house directly across the road, opened her front door at some point during those 40 minutes and looked over. She saw Constance sitting on the suitcase. She looked for 4 seconds. Then she went back inside and closed her door. Constance watched this happen and did not change her posture. A Keke Napek came down Rumuala Road at 12:02. She flagged it and gave the driver Auntie Chidma's address in Rumuakuta and did not look back at the house as the Keke pulled away. The mango tree at the side of the house was visible in the gap between the fence and the gate pillar. She had planted it from a stone. She did not know who would water it now. Auntie Chidinma was 73 years old and had been a widow for 16 years and kept a house on Emenike Street that smelled of camphor and fried akara in the mornings. She had not been told Constance was coming, but when the Keke stopped at her gate and Constance came through with a broken-wheeled suitcase, Auntie Chidinma looked at her face once and said nothing except, "The room at the back is swept." She had Constance's bags in the back room before Constance had finished washing her hands. And she put a mug of ginger tea on the bedside table without being asked and closed the door softly on her way out. The ginger tea was hot and too sweet because Auntie Chidinma's generation measured kindness in sugar. Aunt Constance held it between both palms and sat on the narrow bed and looked at the wall and felt the silence of the room settle around her. She had 30 million naira in her dress pocket, a suitcase she had packed herself, and 64 years of being a person to whom none of this should have happened. She did not cry, not that afternoon, not that evening, not in the 3 days that followed. She had passed the point in her life where crying was the thing that happened next. Pauline's phone rang at 1:14 that afternoon. Pauline was 61 years old and had lived in Enugu for 35 years and was a retired secondary school biology teacher who woke at 5 every morning out of habit and kept a garden larger. Tan Constances, by 6 additional beds. She answered before the second ring the way she always answered when Constance called, which was immediately, because Constance rarely called in the middle of a workday, and when she did, it meant something. Constance told her what had happened, starting from the locksmith at 8:47 and ending at the KK ride, in a voice that stayed even the whole way through. Pauline listened without interrupting, which was also how Pauline had always listened. When Constance finished, Pauline said, "Stay on the line." She was gone for 4 minutes. When she came back, she said, "I'm calling someone." Constance sighed, "Don't involve anyone." Pauline said, "The someone I'm calling is already involved." She would not say more than that. She told Constance to rest, to eat something to let Auntie Chidinma make her tea, and to keep her phone charged. She cited the way you say things to a person you are going to take care of without their cooperation if necessary. Constance held the phone after Pauline rang off. She thought about asking for more information. She decided not to ask. Pauline had never moved in a direction that was not useful. That much had always been true. If this story is already pressing on something in your chest, stay with me. Because what Pauline knew, what she had been carrying without telling Constance for 3 years, is what changes the shape of everything that follows. His name was Chief Tobena Okafor. He was 71 years old and he lived in a house in old government residential area in Enugu that had been in his family since 1958. And he was the kind of man whose name, when it entered a room, rearranged the acoustics slightly. He had known Constance's late husband, Emeka, from before Dubem was born. Emeka had worked under him for 11 years at the Federal Mortgage Bank in Lagos before illness took him in 2003. Constance had been 38 years old when Emeka died. She had raised Dubem on a civil service salary, one school fees installment at a time. And Chief Tobena had sent a letter of condolence in 2003 that Constance had kept in the inner flap of her Bible for 22 years, not because it was extraordinary, but because it had arrived and been real, and said simply, "He was the most honest man I worked beside." I do not say this about many people. Pauline had run into Chief Tobena at a church program in Enugu in 2022. He had asked after Constance. Pauline had told him what she knew, that she was in Port Harcourt, that she was well, that her son was doing very well. Chief Tobena had said, "Tell her Tobena greets her." And then he had paused and said, "Tell her also that Emeka's land in Opara is still in his name. I have been holding the file for 11 years waiting for her to claim it." Pauline had come home from that church program and called Constance, and Constance had said, "I don't want to bother anyone about that." And Pauline had said, "Constance," in the specific tone that meant, "We will return to this." They had not returned to it until now. The land in Okpara was a plot of 1,200 square meters that Emeka had purchased in 1999 for land appreciation, before his illness, before Eco registered it to anything other than his personal name. It had sat in a Land Bureau file in Enugu State for 11 years because no one had come forward to claim it. And Chief Tobena, who knew the land officer from their time together on the State Housing Board, had quietly ensured the file was kept open and not reverted. The value of the land was not what it had been in 1999. In 2024, with the expansion of the Enugu-Onitsha Expressway, and the new light industrial corridor that had come up 7 kilometers to the east, that plot of land was worth somewhere between 14 and 18 million naira, depending on who was doing the valuing and on which side of the transaction they were standing. Pauline made the call. Chief Tobena said he would drive to Port Harcourt himself. He arrived on Thursday morning at 10:30 in a black Mercedes S-Class with a driver who wore a pressed white shirt and did not speak unnecessarily. Chief Tobena was a tall man, thin in the way that very old disciplined men are thin, wearing a dark gray agbada with no embroidery, no ornamentation, nothing that announced anything. It smelled of sandalwood and the faint coolness of air conditioning. He walked into Auntie Chidinma's front room, where Constance was sitting, and he looked at her for a long moment and said, "You look like your husband." She had not expected that. She pressed her lips together and held herself still. He sat across from her and said, "I've brought the file." He placed it on the table between them. A brown folder, thick, with a rubber band around it, and a small sticker on the front in handwriting she did not recognize. Inside was a copy of the original purchase agreement from 1999, a letter from the Enugu State Land Bureau confirming that the registration was still pending under the name Emeka Augustine Ndukwe, and a current valuation certificate dated November 2024, signed by a licensed surveyor. The number at the bottom of the valuation certificate was 16,300,000 naira. Constance looked at the number for a long time. She had come to Auntie Chidinma's house on Tuesday with 30,000 naira in an envelope and a suitcase with a broken wheel. She looked at the number and she said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say. Everything would need to be legally transferred first, registered in her name. The appropriate processes followed. Chief Tobena had already spoken to a solicitor. The solicitor said 6 weeks, possibly 4, if the Land Bureau officer was cooperative. Chief Tobena said he will be cooperative. He stayed for 1 hour. He drank the tea Auntie Chidinma brought without being asked, and did not make anyone feel that he was doing them a favor, which was the thing Constance noticed most. He sighed. Before he left, Emeka would have done this himself by now. "I should have called you earlier. I was waiting for you to ask." He paused. "You were always going to be too proud to ask." She sighed. "Yes," he said. "That's not a flaw, Constance. That's just who you are." He left at 11:42. Constance sat in Auntie Chidinma's front room for a long time after the sound of the Mercedes had faded from the street. Auntie Chidinma came in and sat beside her and said nothing, which was the correct thing to do. Outside the window, the sound of a hawker going down the road, groundnut, groundnut, fresh groundnut, a dog somewhere at the back of a yard. The ordinary, mid-morning sound of a life continuing. Dubem received a letter on the 30th of December. Not a phone call, not a text, a letter on white paper written in the clean, even hand of a woman who had been writing everything she meant down her whole life, delivered by courier to his office address, because she did not want to send it to the house on Rue Mola Road. She did not know who lived in that house now. She had stopped counting the days since she had left it. The letter said 3 things. It said that she was well. It said that she had secured her own accommodation and was not in need of anything from him. Each said that if he ever found himself somewhere in his life where he needed to remember the difference between what he owned and what he was worth, he was welcome to call her. She would pick up. She did not sign it with a complaint. She signed it, "Your mother, Constance." She did not receive a reply. She had not written the letter to receive one. By March of the following year, the land transfer was complete. Constance Ndukwe stood on the plot in Okpara on a Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock with Chief Tobena and the surveyor and looked at 1,200 square meters of red earth with low grass and 1 neem tree at the southeast corner. A developer had already made an initial inquiry. She had not decided anything yet. She walked the perimeter slowly, in the dark blue wrapper and blouse with the embroidered collar, the same one she had put on the morning she left Rumola Road, because she had understood that morning what kind of occasion it was, and she understood this one also. The soil was dry and cool under her feet. The neem tree had leaves down to near the ground. She stopped at the southeast corner and put her hand on the bark and stood there for a moment. Just stood, in the particular way that people stand when they are taking account of something. Her husband had bought this land in 1999, the year Dubem turned 21, the year before the illness began to show. He had said, when he bought it, that he was buying it for later. He had not lived to see what later would mean. She had not known the land existed until 3 years ago, and had not moved to claim it until necessity arrived on her doorstep with a locksmith at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning. That is the part that stays with you. The land had always been there. What Emeka left her had always been there. All it had needed was for the door to close so she would turn and walk in the right direction. Dubem thought he left her with nothing. A broken-wheeled suitcase, 30,000 naira folded into a dress pocket, a room at the back of an old woman's house that smelled of camphor and akara. He thought the locks settled the matter. He thought a house with his name on the deed was the whole story. But underneath the story he believed he was writing. A different one has been accumulating since 1999. It had been accumulating in the soil of a plot in Okpara and in a brown folder held in a Land Bureau file and in the memory of a man who had once written, in a letter of condolence, that Emeka Ndukwe was the most honest man he had worked beside. That letter had been kept in the inner flap of a Bible. That man had kept a file open for 11 years on the strength of the kind of person Emeka had been and on the kind of person that kind of man would choose to marry. You cannot take what a person has earned over the whole course of their life. Not with a locksmith. Not with 30 million naira in an envelope meant to settle a debt that cannot be settled in any currency. What a woman builds in 64 years of being decent, of being honest, of cooking 3 dishes for a guest who will not look at her, of ironing her house dresses at 6 in the morning, because her mother taught her that the standards you keep when no one is watching are the only standards that mean anything. What all of that builds, quietly, in the people who are watching. That is not a resource that expires when the deed is in someone else's name. There are things that cannot be taken from a person. There are files kept open on their behalf. There are men who drive 4 hours to deliver what is already theirs. There are sisters who make one phone call that changes the entire direction of a Tuesday. The world does not always announce when it has been keeping something in trust for you. Sometimes it waits until a door closes, until a suitcase is packed by someone else's hand. Until you sit on that suitcase with a straight back and your feet flat on the ground and your hands in your lap, and only then does it show you what has been yours all along. If someone took something from you that they had no right to take, a room, a position, a place in a family, and then life opens something else, something you didn't know was waiting, leave your answer in the comments. I want to know, did anyone keep a door open for you when you didn't know it needed keeping? And if a mother gave 30 years to raise a son into comfort, and that son gave her 30,000 naira and a broken suitcase in return, what would you say to him now? Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks, until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.